Hey, everybody. We are back. This is the Jack Murphy Live podcast. You can find me, Jack Murphy, at Twitter at Jack Murphy Live. You can go to my website, jackmurphylive.com, sign up for the mailing list, go to Amazon, buy my book, Democrats Are Deplorable, and please help support the cause. Thank you for tuning back in. I really appreciate it. We've had some great guests lately, and leading up to today, we have an even better guest coming on, John Robb. He is a former military captain in the Air Force, a technology company CEO, and a thought leader in understanding open source intelligence networks, the future of communication and politics. And he has an amazing Patreon and blog called Global Guerrillas. That's the best $5 you will ever spend on the internet. I highly recommend you go out and get that. He's also available on Twitter. And I'm very excited to have him here with us today. So, John, thank you so much. And how are you doing?
Oh, doing pretty good. Thanks, Jack.
Oh, awesome. So like I was saying to you before, I like to give a little bit of context for the listeners so that they understand who we're talking to here. And you have such an impressive background. I thought we'd spend a few minutes just talking about how you came to the point where you're at today. And one of the first things that jumps off the page at me is that you were, I think, a captain in the Air Force and were involved in some really interesting stuff. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I went to the Air Force Academy, and that's the easiest way to become a pilot in the Air Force. At least it used to be. Astronautical engineering was hoping to get into the space program, but halfway through pilot training, the shuttle blew up and the space program just pretty much died. So I ended up switching gears and ended up going through C-130s for a couple of years. And then I got drafted into a special ops unit.
And what kind of aircraft were you piloting in those things? Because that just blows my mind.
A variety of different aircraft.
Okay. Okay. And then after the military, you went on to, I think you went on to Yale for graduate school, and then you started a couple of tech enterprises. Can you talk about a couple of those? Because I think I read that you were involved in one of the first blogging platforms. Is that right?
Yeah. When I got out of grad school, it was 95. And I was looking for a job, and they had this, when Wired was a bi-monthly, Wired magazine. Yeah. So it was a bi-monthly at the time, and they had an interview with this guy called George Colony. He's the CEO of Forrester Research. If you've heard of Forrester, it's a technology research company in Cambridge. Yeah. And it asked him what he did all day. And he said, well, I sit at the windowsill looking out over Harvard Square with my feet up on thinking about the future of technology. And I thought, okay, I want to do that. I want to think about the future of technology looking out over Harvard Square. So I applied, and somehow, it was the most intense interview process I've ever been through. It ended up with like 15 analysts versus me for 2 hours defending a point. Yeah. And these guys are all, razor sharp, and they're out for blood. So I ended up coming in right at the beginning of the internet, and they hadn't really developed their internet coverage, and I was writing about it, and I ended up becoming the guy that every paper quoted. So I had every week it was Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Business Week, constantly quoting me. And I spent hours and hours on the phone with these reporters and talking to companies, and got involved in virtually every startup. Every startup that launched on the internet between 95 and 97 came through my doors talking to me. Yeah, it was cool. And somehow I had a kind of a knack for figuring out how technology was evolving and where it was going, and how to explain it simply. So ended up getting out of Forrester in 97 and starting an e-commerce or e-finance startup. And back in 97, there weren't any big companies in finance online. It was just, they were just starting, and they saw their business shift over. So I did a company called Gomez. We did rated the brokers and the banks, and then we ended up building a performance network that tested the transaction systems of these brokers and banks from 52 cities around the world. 23 different internet backbones. It was like a big technical thing, and that ended up selling for about $300 million a couple years ago. Yeah, I also learned about finance. My role, even though I built the thing, diminished over time. And then I left that in 2001 and joined a company called Userland. And I had written a report back in 97 at Forrester. I called personal broadcast networks. This idea that every individual would publish to this system, and then people would subscribe to it, and then there would be this network of self-publishing of text and video and images, and people were looking at me like I was crazy. It was like, what are you talking about? I had Netscape and Microsoft knocking on my door saying, what is this? How do you build it?
Right.
And I gave them some ideas, but it really wasn't built yet, but I knew that was coming. So I was looking around, and I saw a company in 2001 called Userland, and they had the first personal blogging system, and they had a spec they were working on called RSS.
Wow.
And I joined them, and we launched the first personal blogging platform, which had a publish and subscribe feature where you could subscribe using RSS. We opened the spec up for everybody to use, and a really simple syndication became kind of the standard for a bit. And you'd get a feed that looked very similar to Twitter. And it had the RSS had that limited number of characters, and it looked exactly like a Twitter feed. And then you could take any of those items, and then you could add some text to it and post it to your blog. So it was basically like an early Twitter, early Facebook.
Wow.
Back in 2001, and it got big. It got really started to take off when cut a deal with the New York Times to start having them syndicate their content using RSS. So amazing. Yeah, that kind of turned the tide on that. But 3 years later, there's Facebook started and in a dorm room using that same model, and Twitter took off a couple years after that, and we have what we have, but wasn't able to make money on it, but it was fun doing that.
Right. And RSS still very, very well used and popular today, right? I mean, I publish podcasts via RSS.
Yep. And so in about 2003, I was watching what was going on with the war in Iraq, and I saw some stuff that was familiar to me, both doing counterterrorism, counterinsurgency work earlier in my military career, and then what I knew about the internet and open source software development, and how the internet changes the way we structure organizations. How phone systems, ubiquitous wireless technology structures organizations. And so I started a blog called Global Guerrillas in 2003 and started writing. And I did that for years, and it got bigger and bigger. And I ended up publishing a book in 2007 called Brave New War. Then ended up being pretty popular. Chairman of Joint Chiefs read it and was waving it around.
Right.
I ended up doing briefings with the CIA and the NSA and all over the DoD and the JCS for years. And
what was the basic thesis of the book?
Yeah, the premise is that insurgency and warfare was changing, and that when we used to fight insurgency, there used to be a single cohesive group. There was a political cadre at the top, and they had different departments that mirrored what you saw in the nation state. So you had economics, Ministry of Propaganda, you and then the end result was a pyramid-like organization. So if you wanted to roll it up, like you would in Algeria or you would in Vietnam, you'd work on the bottom, you find somebody that was vulnerable, flip them, and get them to report on the person above them. And then on and on and on up till you get to the leadership cadre, and then you kill them or imprison them, and the whole thing collapses. Well, modern insurgency is different. It looks like an open source network. And in open source software, you have lots of different groups coming together to build something complex. And these groups, these individuals don't have to agree on anything other than that they want to move the insurgency forward or the product forward.
Right.
And in Iraq, we had upwards of 70 different groups, all cooperating together to fight the insurgency. And there was, a bunch of different flavors of jihadis. There was, Baathists that were pro-Saddam, Baathists who were anti-Saddam. There were nationalists. There were criminal organizations. And whenever we found one of these groups and rolled them up, there was, another 69 to go. And then the group, you'd go up like one or two layers, and that was it. That was the end of the group.
Right.
And then there was a commercial interactions where people were selling their expertise. You had different, when you laid an IED, there was the bomb maker, the financier, the emplacer, who usually had a hole in the bottom of the wheel, the footwell of their car, so they can place the IED. Then you had a scouter who would find the best place to do it, and that would hit a convoy, and then the trigger man. And the trigger people usually would video, what they were doing, and then use that as collateral for selling their services to do the next IED job.
And these were lessons that we learned in Iraq, you're saying, and elsewhere?
Yeah, that was just from Iraq. So my projection was, here's all these, there's a very different dynamic here, and that this is going to change, protest, politics, and warfare, and the potential is that we're going to see a lot of disruption because these small groups can, do a lot of damage because they can do something called systems disruption, which is kind of like sabotage in the old days, but we're a much more networked and interconnected world now.
Right.
And that means that systems disruption is like a whole nother, 2 or 3 orders of magnitude, more damage. If you hit the system or hit the network in the right place, you knock out the right node. I call it the system punkt, which is similar to in blitzkrieg warfare. You have the Schwerpunkt. It's like the point of greatest emphasis for breaking through the enemy's line, and then you send the tanks into the rear area. In the network warfare, you would have the system punkt, and you would knock that out, and that would cause a cascade of failure that would knock out the entire network, and then cascade into the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and that very small groups, even individuals could do that. Right. And initially, I was looking mostly at the physical infrastructure rather than the online, infrastructure,
right.
Political and social, because I figured it was harder to do. It was very, very easy to do the physical, and we had examples of it, like in Nigeria, where the group called MEND, which is the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, was wiping out about 1 million barrels a day of oil production, and it was the light, sweet crude that we love. Without the sulfur content. And we're doing that in 2006 and 2007. And we saw the same thing in Iraq, where the oil production that we hoped to have after Saddam was gone didn't materialize. In fact, it went down because of the insurgents that are knocking out the oil.
So these lessons that we learned, does that mean that we were wholly unprepared to face them? Because if I remember, it seemed like Rumsfeld and the crew, they wanted to take out the top, and they thought that was sort of going to be the end of it, if I'm remembering correctly. I mean, this is a while ago, and I was not quite as old then as I am now, but that seemed to be my general, take from just being a lay person involved.
Oh, most definitely. They were totally floored. I mean, they were wiped out in terms of ideas, in terms of how to respond to this. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about how to respond to this using, thinking in terms of open source dynamics back in New York Times in 2005. And that got me my initial publicity and visibility to write the book. But when they started using the thinking in the book and started looking at the world in a different way, solutions presented themselves. And in Iraq, the interesting thing was that the Al-Qaeda in Iraq forked the insurgency a bit. And what they did is they blew up the Golden Mosque, which is, trying to create more of a Shiite civil war.
Okay.
And that initiated basically an ethnic cleansing of Baghdad, where these big Shia militias started rolling through Baghdad, cleansing neighborhood after neighborhood. And the insurgents were caught between these big militias that they couldn't form a big enough defense to defend themselves against them. And if they did, they were hit by the Iraqi military and the U.S. military. So they were caught in this 3-front war. I mean, it's total losing position, all caused by the Al-Qaeda expanding the fight. And forking the insurgency and bringing it in a direction that it wasn't designed to go.
Right. Do you think that we've sufficiently learned those lessons from then and from your book?
Oh, I don't think so. It was just lucky that Petraeus was listening to his lower level commanders and heard that these groups were ready to flip and work with the Americans in order to stop the ethnic cleansing from wiping them out. And then the fact that they listened and they caught the opportunity, was the good thing. We certainly didn't see it in the macro level that we should have. I mean, we're still in Afghanistan. One we started doing the same kind of thing in Syria. It's just a bad grand strategy. That's what I wrote about in January.
Right.
Failure of grand strategy.
Just a little bit more on the subject before we transition, which I think this is actually a smooth transition into the main topic for today. I used to work with a guy who was head of one of the largest electrical associations, and by that I mean like power companies and power grids. And he used to spend a ton of time cooperating with the national security folks to try to harden or whatever, safeten our vulnerabilities in the electrical grid, because that's obviously like a really weak point and a high leverage opportunity for damage on a system level. Do you think, and how are we reacting in the United States to like the opposite sort of tactics being used against us here domestically?
I think we did pretty good. I mean, what I found is that a lot of the effectiveness of system disruption depends on how tight the market is. So in oil, because the market was tight because of Chinese demand increasing in the early 2000s, every bit of disruption just drove the price up. It went up in 2007. Remember, it went up to $147 a barrel.
Right.
Yeah, peaked there.
Right.
And in terms of electricity, it works most effectively when there's peak demand, but it's got to be tied to a larger political movement or a larger political kind of situation. And we haven't gotten to that point yet.
Right.
So when we do, I suspect we'll probably see that flare up pretty quickly. It's been very effective in terms of, because once you start bringing down the infrastructure, what happens is people search for sources of order and sources of protection that are local if they're not getting it at the national level. And that causes very quick polarization.
Right.
It happened in Iraq. It happens in other places where that kind of disruption occurs.
You said when we do. That sounds pretty certain. Do you think that that type of circumstances are inevitable here domestically?
Oh, well, no. I mean, I probably overstepped there, but
okay.
If it happens versus when, it's far easier to disrupt online and disrupt social systems than it is disrupting physical systems.
Right, which is a great segue into the main conversation for today, because I live in that online world. I live in that information matrix, and I have personally been involved in being attacked by what I think what you call as open network insurgencies, and basically mobs coming to hit me where it hurts the most in my professional reputation, taking away my ability to earn income for my family, getting me banned and stricken from coaching Little League, even like putting pressure on my landlord to evict me from my residence. All because of sort of what I would consider to be misinformation, disinformation spread about me because someone decided one day I was the target. Right. And so this is sort of the environment that I'm living in personally, and I want to talk about sort of the grander picture, which you've written about a ton. And I had Jordan Hall on yesterday, and we were talking extensively about the Blue Church. And he was calling the opposition the red religion, and I believe you had been calling it also sort of the red insurgency. And most of my listeners are definitely red versus blue, and so we definitely enjoy that perspective. And so I wanted to just start off this conversation with you by talking about, can you tell me what is the insurgency as you see it today, and what is the context, and what is the context politically, culturally, and sort of give your definition and your sort of perspective on that, and then we can, go on from there.
Sure. Yeah, Jordan's a good friend of mine. We've been trying to think about this for quite a long time, but we have slightly different takes. I approached it from what I saw in terms of how people were actually engaging in conflict, and then worked back from there. I don't, theory craft first and then try to find examples. Okay. I work from examples back. So what I saw back in 2000, I guess it'd be 2015, 16, is that there was an insurgency forming, an online insurgency, an open source insurgency, and they were starting to back Trump. And that drew on the earlier Tea Party roots. it all goes back to the big financial crisis that was unaddressed, that kind of really shattered a lot of the legitimacy of the American government. In 2008, it wasn't even so much that people lost money, which it was a big deal, but it was that they didn't punish anyone for it.
Right. Like not a single person was prosecuted in the state of New York. Yeah.
Right. And, and they didn't do the kind of big programs to get people out. And the same thing is happening in Europe because of German austerity. They've never been able to kind of spend their way out of the eternal recession that they've been in since 2008.
Right.
So, the Germans got them in a hammerlock.
And the real estate thing is, so it was very fascinating for me because at that time I was actually working in real estate, and I originally had worked for a hedge fund in 2000 to 2003 or so. Yep. And then I transitioned from there into real estate, and I was doing on the ground real estate development. I was a broker, a builder. We owned an architecture firm. We did design build. We did multifamily properties, commercial properties and such. And so like I lived seeing people that made like $14,000 a year come to the table with four loans at 115% LTV, who had no business buying condos. Right. And I'm sitting there across the table collecting my $300,000 from this person that I knew was not ever going to be able to manage this. And man, I lived the insanity. And with my background in the hedge fund and fixed income finance, I understood the mortgage-backed security system and how the liquidity was being pumped into the system and how underwriting standards had totally collapsed. And it was just basically like a giant bilking of the entire nation to feed Wall Street. And then when it all went to shit, nobody got in trouble. And when I both read the book, The Big Short, and saw the movie, and I got to tell you, watching the movie, I got emotional because it was such a scam perpetrated on the American people, and then nobody went punished. And I, people like to blame Bush or Obama for the way they handled it, but the truth is they both had their hand in it, and it was sort of not a Democrat issue, not a Republican issue, but really an establishment issue, right? Where they both just turned their back on the regular people, and really that was the point at which income inequality and wealth inequality in the United States exploded in a basically straight up fashion on the chart, I think, right?
Right. And the legitimacy just evaporated.
Yeah.
Which was the key thing, is like, people that used to trust in the system actually, the trust was a little shaken after the Iraq War, getting into a war based on false pretenses. That had nothing to do with 9/11. Right. It was just a war of choice, and it was stupidly conceived and poorly fought. And even Afghanistan was bad because 18 years of doing the same thing. Next year is going to be better. Let's keep on going.
Right.
That's just, it shakes your trust in the system. But the financial crisis was really like, wow. This is really corrupt. This is like. And when the damage done, if you're looking at lost growth and everything else, it's about $30 trillion.
Right.
That's just an insane amount of money.
Right.
And we had the opportunity, and it really was also an opportunity for us to take on this, big project. I call it, tilting at windmills. I think I might write about this. Windmill theory is that we need a big project in the post-Cold War era to kind of keep us focused on the future and keep us together. We did that with like building the internet in the late 90s. Everyone was focused on that. That absorbed our attention. Billions went into it, and we had long-term benefits from that.
Right.
And then in the response to terrorism in the early 2000s, even though we spent $5.5 trillion on these wars, it brought us together for about a decade.
Yeah.
And then we had the financial crisis, and it should have brought us together, cleaning it up.
Right.
And getting us out of that thing, but we didn't do anything.
Right.
We lost, and all of a sudden the nation started fracturing, and they're going, what are we doing together?
Right.
Why are we even, are these people are even, related to me? Or, I call it fictive kinship, is this idea of nationalism. This idea of a nation is based on something called, fictive kinship. We have common stories. Yeah. We have common goals. We're better, they're kind of related to me.
Yeah.
I trust what they say because they're related to me.
Right. An imagined order that we all adhere to, and then we all sort of believe in the same narrative. And that's the way that we maintain unity. And one thing, pardon me if I meant to say this too many times throughout today, but one thing Jordan said yesterday was that the financial crisis also was like a sign of the end of the meritocracy. Like
Right.
it exposed once and for all the final exposure that the people who were leading us weren't necessarily the best at leading us. They were just simply the best at attaining power and then using it to their advantage.
Most definitely. But it was a sign that the economic meritocracy was flawed and broken.
Yeah.
Because the guys that were making the big bucks were doing it in a criminal fashion, and they weren't getting punished for it. So you could, steal $1 billion, not go to jail, not even be castigated, and then you could steal $1 and you go to jail, right?
Right.
And then you have the other side, the government, which is this, and the academia, and everybody who is thinking about how to manage the country. And they said, trust us, we're authorities, we're experts, and they got it so horribly wrong.
Right.
I mean, when you have people up there saying, this is a 1 in 10,000 year crisis, and my friend Nassim Taleb would talk about, what data set are you using? 1 in 10,000 years. I mean, we even had this system for more than a couple decades. So it's 1 in 10,000 years making that kind of projection is just nuts.
Right.
But it showed that they were hollow. That they didn't have any. In a complex world, the world is too complex for their expertise to have as much value as it used to. The world used to be more just complicated. Okay, and then you could engineer society to a certain extent using expertise, and that now we're complex.
Would you talk about the difference between complicated and complex, because that's something that sort of keeps coming up in conversations that I'm having, and it sounds like semantics, but it's really not. It's a very clear distinction, right?
Yeah, I wrote a report on that a couple months ago. So if you get to that in the thing, it talk about how to manage a complex world, or a society in a complex world. It's this. So there's 4 classes of systems. There's the simple, and that's like simple heuristics, which are, simple decision-making processes that we follow every day. You get up in the morning and you go to work and things like this, and you know how to solve those. And then there's a complicated world, a complicated system. And that's like what you do with engineering. And that's what, doctors do. You get degrees and you can handle, lots of complexity, and things work according to the rules of, that we've developed. Mm-hmm. But, it takes a lot of education and to do that well at the large scale. And then you move into what's called complexity, and in a complex world, the system takes on characteristics that aren't predicted. It has emergent features and goes in directions that you couldn't anticipate. And it's not just because everything is interrelated. It's it creates its own tendencies and follows through with those. So you could have a policy that goes in one direction, day 1, and day 3, the policy is not working anymore because the system changed completely overnight.
Right.
So it's like Starbucks and their policy about having everyone pay for a coffee or something before they use the bathroom. Well, within a day, that whole policy was thrown to hell. Mm-hmm. And they had to change it and fix it and come up with something else. Or face another firestorm and face, boycotts and face all this other stuff. So, I mean, it's amazing how quickly that's just a goofy little example, but the thing is, it works like that everywhere now. So these guys who are experts with these, even 1-year plans, they can't get more than a couple months into these plans before they fall apart.
Right. Because acting within the system changes the system itself, right?
Yeah. Or the system is just moving in directions that you can't anticipate.
Right.
All right. And that, what you can do, you can't even really make the kind of predictions as to what the system will be if you undertake this action or that action. Often, what you have to do is prototype or come up with 5 or 6 different potential actions, get them out there, and find which one actually takes hold, and you reinforce the one that actually is getting traction.
Mm-hmm. And we see that in our information conflict today, right? Yeah,
it's just the system is constantly discrediting the experts, which then creates this kind of roiling atmosphere. Nothing seems to work. Everything seems to be broken. No one seems to be able to fix stuff. We can't get healthcare because we pay 3 times more than everybody else in the world. I mean, right now, for instance, we pay as much per capita in public healthcare money as Germany and every other developed country in the world. We pay as much, but we only insure about 1/3 of the people. Or if we want to build a piece of, a mile of subway costs 3 times as much as anywhere else in the world. And the people doing the work get paid the same. So, we can't, there's all these like built-in things that are preventing us from getting things done. And you move in one direction and you're facing obstacles you didn't anticipate. So, one of the things that this environment makes possible is that you can use disruption to push a complex system into chaos, right? And in chaos, it's very uncomfortable and people get really nutty. And chaos is when everybody is making decisions on their own without reference to anybody else. Right. Without any reference to any kind of known rules. They're just making stuff up on the fly as they're going through. They're grasping at straws, and they're not working in concert. And so it's very uncomfortable to be there, and people don't want to be there. What happens is if you can get a system into chaos, like through a disruption, a political disruption, when it comes back out of chaos into complexity, you can reset the system. You can change the dynamics of the system, change the dynamics of the debate. We saw that happening in immigration recently. Every time it got chaotic, when it came back, it was moving it closer towards one pole or the other. So getting back, getting out of this kind of this world is, how it works is that what I saw early on in 2016 is that it was something I called it open source insurgency. Right. And we had seen that in politics in Egypt and other places. It was open source protest, where lots of different groups, everything from the Muslim Brotherhood to the democratic groups, the feminist groups in Egypt, all came together in an open source protest. And they only had one goal, one plausible promise, was to get rid of Mubarak, which was the source of all their corruption. And they all stayed together until that ended. And the leadership of that protest, they didn't let anyone take control of it and hijack it whenever they wanted to talk about, a new constitution or this or that. People just ignored them. Only the leaders that actually moved them towards getting rid of Mubarak, they followed. Right. And so we had something similar with Trump, is that he was like a grenade for the insurgency to go into Washington and disrupt it. And they backed him. And as long as he was a grenade, people continue to back him.
Right. So did you see the beginning of the insurgency before Trump announced and before he started shaking things up and doing his thing? Like the groundwork was there? What were the conditions that enabled that? Because I've always argued that the Trump phenomenon is, at least in retrospect, a predictable outcome of the circumstances prior to the 2016 election. And it's not that Trump came in and started and changed everything and made it, bent it all to his will. He just happened to be, whether out of pure genius or happenstance, riding the right wave at the right time.
Yeah, I don't see him as much of a leader as a kind of a weapon of the insurgency.
I see.
Right. So they propel him forward. He channels them. It gives him some certain superpowers. I mean, like, for instance, anything he's attacked for that isn't part of, the reason the insurgency is held together is ignored. So, all the Access Hollywood tapes and everything else, that doesn't matter. It all just fell, it would have killed a normal politician. It didn't even touch him because people weren't looking at him as a candidate per se. They were seeing him as a weapon, and they were sending it into Washington to break things.
Let's identify the theys and the who's.
Well, everybody who was shaken by the 2008 financial crash. Right. Really, where that legitimacy was lost for them, and they saw things were totally broken and corrupt, and they wanted change.
Right.
And they wanted not just a little bit of change. They, in fact, a lot of them voted for Obama, looking for that change. They didn't get it, and the people who weren't getting it from the Republican Party. They were just part of the problem. They would say that they were trying to clean things up, or X, Y, Z, and they weren't doing anything. And this was a chance to first, roil the Republican Party, take it over, and then take over the White House. And it's a lot of different groups. It was like it's hard to even classify because it was more individuals
Right.
than it was like formal groups that were coming together under to push Trump forward.
Right.
And the thing about open source insurgencies, they're amazingly innovative. We saw this in Iraq is that, the IED designs weren't developed by, one cadre dedicated to that. There were, thousands of different developers. And if they came up with something good, they spread it throughout the whole insurgency. The plans were shared. And like open source software. We had a $3 billion program to counter IEDs. We'd come up with a countermeasure, and 3 weeks later, they would have a counter to our counter. Right. It went fast. I mean, they did as much in about a year as the IRA did in 20 in terms of innovation. So they were really, really quick. And the same thing with the Trump's insurgency is that they were coming in this case, they're coming up with different types of attacks and different types of framing things, framing issues. And he would take things out of that, the contribution basket, and then give it national platform using Twitter and other things.
You think he crowdsourced his platform rather than came at it top down?
Correct.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of people, of course, in the camp. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
There's lots of people in the campaign and other places that would say they're all claiming credit for it, but it was the insurgency that did it.
Right.
I mean, I was interviewed a week after Trump on Reddit's The Donald.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and those guys, the 300,000 there, there's 300,000 centipedes that they're working on that stuff every day.
Yeah.
And 4chan guys, and everybody who's kind of like, memetic boiler rooms. I mean, they were like in the garage, innovating, finding ways to spread it. And then it went through Facebook. And the cool thing about Facebook and the danger from the elite perspective is that there's no single place you could stand on Facebook and see everything. It's not a broadcast medium, right? So everything is broken into these little neighborhoods. And so when the message goes out, it goes out on a neighborhood level and you can't see it from above. And so it made it possible for lots of information and lots of, kind of insurgent, memetic kind of warfare, disruptive stuff to get distributed without any counter. Without any break.
So my first instinct when you mentioned 4chan is that those guys didn't lose their shirts in the financial crisis in 2008, nor did they have their heads all the way so far up like TARP and the application of all that debt and such. Do you think that, and maybe I'm wrong, but do you?
No, they're angry in different ways.
That's what I was getting
angry.
at. Like,
there was people angry for, it's like the Iraqi insurgency, right? There's people angry for against the 2008 financial crisis, and there's people who are angry at all the the social kind of PC stuff that was like they felt was encroaching. There's a guy who wrote a book, Philip Bobbitt. You ever hear of that? The Shield of Achilles. So he wrote this book back in the early 2000s, and it was really big in foreign policy circles. I mean, it was really popular, and he outlined a kind of this idea that the nation state, this idea of a cohesive nation state that promised economic security and protection and physical protection and cohesiveness was in the post-Cold War world giving way to a thing called the market state. And the market state just provided you opportunity, and it connected up globally. And that opportunity was very kind of a neoliberal kind of idea. But what happened is the political goods they didn't deliver economic progress, economic security. What they offered was the opportunity to become anything, right? More of a kind of an identity explosion. I mean, in Europe, it would be like you can travel anywhere and work anywhere. You don't have any borders and restrictions. You can gender identity. You can have any kind of identity formulation that you're interested in, and they package that as a political good,
right?
As a replacement for economic security, and they put the two at odds, saying that you can't have one without the other. I mean, it's like, and there are a lot of people who, if you're in the upper middle class and you're globally interconnected, and you're doing really, really well, the top 30% typically are in every country, in the developed world, what they're looking at for is, in terms of political goods, is that, that social identity, social borderless kind of political good.
Right.
But for every, the bottom 70%, they're not globally competitive.
Yeah.
They used to be protected by the nation state. They feel abandoned. They're going, it doesn't really matter if I have all this identity stuff. If I'm not making any progress, I'm living, less well off every year.
Yeah.
I can't.
In 2001, I guess, I had finished grad school and I did a joint degree at Georgetown School of Foreign Service in International Affairs and International Finance. And I was set up to be an international investment banker. And I was so excited about joining the global elite and traveling the world and, being in the upper echelon and being supranational and multi-continental. And, the whole thing was so sexy and attractive. And, in my book, I lay out my own guilt about that, about being a former globalist, because I really did drink the dogma a lot wholeheartedly back then. And maybe luckily for me, 9/11 happened and I didn't actually get my job on Wall Street in that field, but like I saw it and I saw the attraction. And then I also began to see what global development was actually doing to people and what it was doing to the middle class, and then what the trade-offs were. And I think that was one of your other points beyond the 2008 financial crisis that sort of has left the confidence in the system shaken, was the impact of global trade and globalization. And I don't necessarily just mean like we trade this for that with China, but like foreign direct investment where we put money into other countries, and demand all these law changes and strip their soils and poison their water and take away their rights. I mean, really the dark underside of globalism is really shady, and what it's done to the middle class too in the United States. I mean, was that one of your fundamental,
Oh yeah, no, I mean, there was so many things we could have done better. In particular, like for instance, in global trade. And I saw kind of like the onboarding of our former enemies of Russia and China after the Cold War ended as one of the kind of the key things that we had to get right after the Cold War ended, and we messed it up.
Right.
And in particular with China is that we just, we thought that just connecting them up to the global market would make them more democratic. It was inevitable, and that it was like unlimited good would come from it.
Right.
And eventually what happened also is that, there was all these companies that wanted to invest, like Apple and stuff, that it had a greed factor to get into China, that was pushing this policy forward. But what happened is that they are a command economy, and, given unrestricted access to the U.S. economy, they were able to, throw resources at, export infrastructure that allowed them to wipe out markets in the States. I mean, their trade deficit grew so fast that it was wiping out company after company across the middle of America, and we did nothing. I mean, adults back in the Cold War era, with Baker, he did. I mean, at least he was adult with when we ran into this with Japan. We said, okay, we saw that they were killing in the U.S. auto industry. We almost killed it, and they said, let's cap it at $60 billion trade deficit. Right. You have to figure out. They went to Japan and said, you have to figure out how to balance this, or just restrict it. And it worked. We saved the car industry. Everything seemed to, stabilize after a while. And we didn't do the same thing with China in 2002. And we were focused on the Middle East instead. It's like we couldn't hold two ideas at the same time.
Yeah.
And we just let it go. And you could actually map the Trump counties, county for county, with the counties that were most affected by Chinese trade.
Wow, that makes perfect sense to me. I remember in school we used to call that false idea, the embrace of death. That like if we just embraced these other countries, that they would then somehow turn into capitalistic, free markets and free minds. But that obviously didn't work. And what's ironic to me in some respects is looking back on I guess it was 1999, the WTO protests in Seattle, and people were protesting, bringing China into the WTO and normalizing trade with them. And I thought that all those people protesting were a bunch of loons. And then 20 years later, I look back and be like, man, they were exactly spot on. And ironically enough, those are also some of the same people that would call themselves Antifa and such today. So it's a very weird circular.
Well,
circular
the China policy, I mean, once you get the grand strategy wrong everything that follows, it just gets worse and worse and worse. It's like a cascade of errors. I mean, not only did we wipe out all those jobs because of Chinese trade, I mean, by sending all these jobs to China, all this manufacturing to China, I mean, they don't have any restrictions on pollution. So they just ramped up the carbon production. And now they produce more carbon than the US and Europe combined.
Wow.
And accelerating away. And there's absolutely nothing we could do in terms of, cleaning it up in the US to even match what their growth is.
Right.
They accelerated all the timelines. Whatever timelines we heard about 5 years ago on climate change, those are all accelerated. I mean, they're just like because of China.
Right.
And the thing is, I can understand the kind of disbelief in it, and pushing back against all this idea climate, because it's coming from experts, right? And experts have been wrong so many times.
Right.
But it's it's just good insurance, prudent. Yeah. If you take some measures and you try to stop flirting, let's say financial crisis or climate crisis, or it's just taking some precautionary measures is actually a smart thing to do, rather than waiting till after the fact.
Totally. And just to wrap up this conversation about Japan and China, Japan definitely in the 80s, this is something that I think journalists and I don't know what you call contemporary historians, people trying to talk about history today, miss about Trump. He grew up, came of age professionally in the 80s in New York City and in real estate. And one of the most prevalent phenomenons in New York City real estate at that time was the Japanese coming with all their mercantilist money and buying up prominent real estate in New York City. And it was all in the news. Also, the Japanese takeover. They also bought like famous golf courses, all kinds of stuff all over the country. And it was also all in the news about how Japan was like killing our auto industry and yada, yada. And then, as you said, we worked out a deal with them, and it seemed to work out for us. So that is the sort of origin story for Trump's perspective on like, we need good deals with our trading partners.
Right. He's trying to put the cork back into the bottle, right. Or like closing the barn door after the horse is gone. Right. It's like trying to, contain China at this point is pretty darn tough.
It is tough, but I bring it up because I am not holding Trump's water or carrying his water every day.
Me neither.
But like to not give him at least some sort of like, I don't know. He's not making this stuff up, right? Like he grew up with this, he lived through it, he saw it, he experienced it, and it was a formative thing for him. And so like these ideas aren't just like coming out of nowhere of him trying to be some strongman maniac or whatnot. But hey, the things that happen to us when we're young and forming our visions of the world and lived experiences have an influence on the way that we behave as we get older. And it's just not an insane behavior on his part. He may be miscalculating, but
well, yeah, I wrote a piece of maybe last year about the thing that really upsets the foreign policy types is that they think they can't see where he's coming from. And the way I explained it is that, he is putting trade policy above national security policy. In a post-Cold War world, we don't really have any enemies. We just don't.
Yeah.
And that's not the priority. It's economic success is the priority. So what he's doing is, before, trade policy was slave to national security policy, and we basically opened up our trading system to anyone that joined us, right. Because we're willing to take the hit in order to stay safe. But without an enemy, that becomes kind of stupid, because you opened up to like 5 different mercantilist nations that are export oriented, and they are all focused on the U.S. because the U.S. has the biggest source of demand in the world. And it makes it hard for us to make money. Yeah. But by putting trade first, that explains his behavior in Europe. Yeah. Particularly with Germany, it explains his behavior with China, and it's something that the national security types just can't wrap their heads around. They're used to the whole Cold War setup, We're not in a Cold War anymore.
Right. And so any contemporary analyst that doesn't use the word mercantilist when talking about international trade and acknowledging our trading partners as acting as such is just either ignorant willfully or ignorant through some sort of indoctrination or whatever. And I get frustrated to no end reading about that stuff. But we can talk about this element of everything for a long time. I want to get back to the insurgency, the network,
Sure.
and so we were talking about 4chan, we were talking about Facebook, we didn't even talk about Twitter, but we're going to get to it. And I want to, talk about how does this insurgency work? Like, what is the method by which it's exerting its will? And let's talk about how these things are an emergent phenomenon rather than like a top-down directed phenomenon, etc. Let's get into like the nitty-gritty functionality of it, because a lot of the guys that I roll with on Twitter and in real life, I think a lot of them credibly had a major influence in this insurgency. People with hundreds of thousands of followers and generating millions and millions of page views and driving media cycles and whatnot. And so I have a personal interest, and my listeners definitely have an interest to think about it holistically and systematically. So how does this insurgency work, and where, what can we expect from it, moving forward?
Okay. Well, good place to start. I have a free report up on the site. It's from December 2017. It's the example I put on the Patreon page. So that's a quick download, and it has it all laid out. And basically, the structure of the warfare we're seeing that I worked out was that there is this open source insurgency that works according to it works in the mental realm, the psychological space. And then there's this thing called the resistance that works in the moral space. And then there's this, then the corporations that work mostly in kind of the attrition area, the area of physical connectivity.
Okay.
And so these got these three players, and they're defined more by how they fight. And the insurgency, the type of warfare, that you engage in when you're in the kind of psychological realm is, maneuver warfare. It's based on, you see it in classical, examples would be blitzkrieg. Maneuver warfare is about, rapid movements to break up the mental cohesion of the enemy. So they can't trust the facts that they're seeing. They become disoriented. They become overloaded. So, like in World War II, when a tank column broke through the enemy's lines, they ranged deep into enemy territory, and they were fueling up at the gas stations and kept on going. Even if there were just a couple tanks, they kept on going, and circling these the troops at the front line. Coming up on towns where they had command and control centers and making them flee. And to the person on the front line, where the bulk of the troops were, they heard that tanks were behind them, and that they weren't getting the ammunition, and they weren't getting the supplies they needed, and they were expending them at a pretty high rate just to maintain where they were at. And they gave up, and they just retreated en masse. They couldn't process the fact that just a few tanks were actually all that stood between them and the rest of their supply lines. It was too disoriented. And the same thing we saw in the online world is where, rapid transience, rapid switch from one disruptive idea to the next would be disorienting and overloading. Things that were challenging challenges to conventional wisdom and technique and convention. Things that caused people pushing hot buttons to cause people to explode and not think clearly. That stuff works exceedingly effectively in the kind of psychological realm of warfare and maneuver warfare. And Trump and his insurgency excel at that. And that, the standard opposition to anything that would grow over time was never able to, form in many cases, like even the trade stuff, right? So we put up barriers to trade, or we put up new tariffs. Typically that would just build, opposition to that would build. And that would dominate the headlines, and the pressure would become intense, and it forced the president to relent. Well, we're switching between so many disruptions that stuff doesn't even make it to the front page. No one's even giving it any thought.
Right. Overload.
Right?
Overload.
Oh, it's overload. Right. So the second one And this came largely in response to the rise of the insurgency and Trump's particular flavor, his particular approach to leading it, is the resistance. And this is moral warfare. This is more guerrilla warfare, actually. And moral warfare works by creating a moral framework that serves as kind of a gravity to your side. Everyone comes to you, and that you look at the enemy and you look for moral weaknesses according to your moral framework, and you call them out. Okay. You shame them, you disconnect them that way, either as individuals or as a group. Largely, it works best online, going after individuals, and you experience that in a straightforward way. Yeah. What happens is it creates distrust, and you distrust when you target somebody, no one wants to be near them or next to them when they're going down. Everyone starts to dissociate from that person. In a guerrilla war, if you can call the nation's morality into question, you can shatter it, and you'll have multiple centers of gravity that will form, and then no one can make decisions because no one can agree on anything. In this case, the kind of moral warfare that we're seeing is proving pretty darn effective. It's also moving into the economic realm with the AOC and the like. And then the third one is the physical disconnection, is the big online companies in particular. And they are, engaging mostly in attrition, depleting the ranks of people they see as threats by disconnecting them. And they tend to ally themselves with the resistance. And my prediction back in 2017 or so was that I was waiting for the leader of resistance to emerge. Somebody who would, lead the resistance to take over the Democratic Party as effectively and as convincingly as Trump did with the Republicans. And there wasn't anyone until just recently with AOC. AOC, the thing is, she doesn't look like a normal leader and stuff, but she's really, really good online. Yes. I mean, her tweets and her social media and Instagram and everything was really amazing. And she has a high degree of authenticity, which is really makes her very effective. I mean, just that little video she put up just recently about campaign finance that she critiqued. Yeah. And that was seen 22 million times in 24 hours. Yeah. That's just nuts. I mean, that's like you take all the audiences of all the news programs and you combine them and you don't get that.
Right, exactly. Now, one thing that you brought up was that you think that and it's obvious that the corporate world is aligned currently with the resistance. And I know that the corporations, the blue church, all the media companies, ad executives, universities, everybody is basically on with the resistance. And, we see them move towards disconnecting people from, you get unpersoned on the internet, you get deleted from Twitter, you get and really now the real crux is like the payment disconnectors, right? Like taking away people's ability to just even receive money. That seems to be a real fatal flaw in this whole insurgency system at this point. But the corporate world and the resistance are aligned. Do you think that is a stable alliance? Because I would argue that like the Bernie guys, who many of whom became Trump supporters because of their disaffect, their dissatisfaction with big corporate, with the blue church, with all the corruption and all that. I would have thought that like the resistance folks would be anti-corporation, but it appears as though that they are in alignment. Do you think that is a temporary thing? Is that a permanent thing? Is it because, like, as you described, in these open insurgencies where they have a common goal, even though they have different ideas about things or different ideas about what would happen after they achieve that goal or different histories and everything?
There's a lot of tension between the corporate world and the resistance. Some, at least in the mid-level manager space and some of the Silicon Valley companies have embraced it, wholesale. But for the most part, a lot of the corporate space is just scared of them. They're just scared. They want to make money, right. But they don't want to piss them off either.
Do you
So
really think making money is still the number one goal, and all the decisions are driven by making the most money possible for their shareholders, and so they
for
perceive an alignment with the resistance as being the best path to profitability?
yes,
Hmm.
on the whole, I mean, they're definitely true believers in a lot of the smaller companies and at the mid-level manager space. Who are like truly part of the resistance, because the resistance is, I mean, it's very puritanical,
Right.
and it's different than the insurgency because it's actually trying to build a new consensus morality, which is
And what's that new consensus morality based upon, John?
well, I think it's okay. So here's the idea: is that we're in a globalized system, and we're throwing lots of people with lots of different backgrounds into the same system. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to renegotiate how individuals interact. Differentials in power. And so a lot of this is based on this core idea of intersectionality.
Yes.
Right, which is almost kind of the original sin of the movement, because it has some flaws in it that will explode over time.
Right. It's fatally flawed. Yeah.
Yeah, but in concept, this idea of coming up with a consensus morality where people from lots of different backgrounds can agree with, a kind of a minimum set of how we rules for how we interact, both online and offline, may be a good thing. But how they do that, how they get there, is the big problem. Because they're getting there through intersectionality, which is like this. I mean, you've probably gone through this on your show already, and it's this idea that everybody's oppressed. Every identity group is oppressed by other identity groups, and at the end of the day, one identity group dominates over everybody else, oppresses everybody. And
who is that?
Oh yeah, which is, in this case, it's in this theory, it's of course white heterosexual males, and they're the top dogs. And so what the goal is to overturn that. I mean, to overthrow them and then set up a new dynamic. It's like the people who are like into Marxist theory would say, then you have this kind of nirvana. The realists would say, when they look at communism, they'd say, okay, this is a chance for us to take control and tell everybody what to do.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is the difference between Marx and or a Lenin or a Stalin. Right. Eventually the hardcore group thinkers would win out. And that you want to put your group at the top.
Right.
So it makes it hard for us for me to join on. I mean, any group that wants to put me in a concentration camp is like, it's like, nah.
Right. So in my book, I go into detail about Kimberly Crenshaw and where intersectionality came from, and like the line at the end of her piece that just says white male power is implicit and understood, and that therein basically is the core centerpiece of this new morality that they're trying to impose on everyone. And I have to say, at the same time, I'm feeling apprehensive and concerned for the future. I'm also feeling slightly justified. I've been talking about intersectionality for almost, coming up on 4 years now, and people would just poo-poo me and tell me I was dumb and crazy. Nobody's thinking about intersectionality. Nobody knows what that is. And that may very well be true. But the core tenets of intersectionality has been infiltrated into and disseminated through the blue church and top-down information distribution, and put into the heads of all these people, as I think partially came to a massive collision in the Kavanaugh hearings, where the language of intersectionality and radical feminism became the language used by the United States senators, the U.S. The Judiciary Committee, in the halls of the Senate, blowing my mind, thinking to myself, people thought I was a nut for years, but now I'm talking to a retired military officer and a tech CEO, and the guy who's been in Wall Street Journal is telling me that intersectionality is the core tenet of this new moral network that the blue resistance is trying to impose on everybody, and using and co-opting really the corporate space in order to enact their sort of their warfare. I mean, man, it's real.
Well, where do people think this whole call out culture comes from?
Right.
I mean, what rules are they violating? I mean, I mean, if they've heard the word patriarchy, they've heard intersectionality.
Right.
Right. If anyone who says that is basically saying, signing on to that whole structure. But, the kind of postmodern thinking in terms of, everybody's oppressed and that, the language used is very important, and the control over what is said, introduction of new terms and banning of others, is pretty dangerous, particularly if they can exert control, over, corporations, particularly the big online social networks, things are going to get pretty dicey because you can start to burn this into AIs.
Right.
And
it's
right?
it's happening already in search algorithms, the way that they hide and reveal information through search. I'm terrified. I mean, these are the guys that are writing the future reality, information reality, have the ideology in their core, and it's going to be expressed. I mean, you said it best, and that's terrifying. Burned into AI. Intersectionality is going to become burned into AI. That's a fair statement?
Yeah, it's scary. I mean, particularly with that kind of original sin notion, is that there's no way you can overcome your identity.
Nope.
Because it has original sin, and only white males have the true original sin.
Right.
So it's an interesting thing.
It's depressing as hell.
It is pretty depressing.
Yeah, it is. All right, we're both sort of weighing the immensity of those statements, and I think it's heavy. It's very heavy. But I mean, we could talk about that particular subject for a long time. But I wanted to keep moving down, because I want to get to eventually talking about AOC, talking about predictions for 2020, talking about what individuals can do in this environment, right? How does, my question here is how does this all fit into the big picture, and what does the future look like? This intellectual red insurgency, the moral blue resistance, and the attrition and physical disconnection of the corporate space, dovetailed also with some ideas is online real? Because I hear people say that it's not all the time, but I'm saying that online is driving reality instead of the other way around.
Trump's in the White House because of it.
Right, exactly.
What are they thinking? It's of course it's real.
Right, I know. And people Twitter isn't real life. I'm sorry, but actually Twitter and social media are driving real life. So you got the causality backwards there. But what does the future look like? How does all this stuff fit into our big picture? How does an individual navigate, operate in this system? How do you protect yourself? How do you thrive? How do you operate? What do you do, John? I mean, you have studied all this stuff. You must have some ideas for what a normal dude and a woman who loves normal dudes in America. What not to put racial tones on normal, but you know what I'm getting at. What do we do?
Okay. Well, I mean, it's Marshall McLuhan called this back in 1967, he wrote, we're in a guerrilla information war where there's no, World War III will be a guerrilla information war where there's no dividing line between the military and the civilian world. And he was right. That's what it is right now. It is. We're seeing this globally, and we're seeing a fight for the future occurring online, and that everyone's a participant, whether you want to or not. You can withdraw and hide and get off social networking, but you're basically just running away from the battle, right?
Right.
Because it's going on. And then the other thing you can. So first, you have to recognize you're in this, and second is trying to figure out how it's actually fought. I mean, I've done my best in terms of trying, and I'm continuing to try to do that in terms of structuring this, in terms of how it's actually fought online, through networks, right? And these networks have very specific ways of fighting. They're very predictive. You can pick your network and participate right now, or you can try to figure out and reinforce ways in which we can use this kind of new network decision-making system to make our current system better. So if you look back over history, every single new decision-making system that we've developed, we've found a way to make it valuable in building civilization. I mean, we have the old tribal thinking, which is like this system of cohesion and fictive kinship that allows us to operate as a unit, as a group where we trust the other members of it, and that's become nationalism. And where we, a nation, this idea of nation, that where we trust other people, even though we don't know them because they're Americans, or because, if you're German and German, or you're French or French. Then we had a bureaucracy, which was great at mobilizing resources and, doing big, undertaking big projects. That really took off in the 20th century, it got massive. But, there was meritocracy and its structured approach that became useful. And we found that the limitations of that, is that it can't take over everything like we saw with communism and fascism. It can be it's without moral structure, and it can be used to, scale up destruction too. Right. Mm. And then we have markets, and markets are great at, finding the value of something and allocating resources in particular. They're really good at, finding the place where the money should flow, the resources should flow. And we've combined them. When we use markets to select the leadership of the bureaucracy, right? We elect people to run our federal government and our state governments. But those, are bureaucracies, and they do certain things. And then we use, this tribal connectivity to stay together and make decisions as a cohesive unit. Now we have this new thing, networks. And networks are, so far we saw with the insurgency, it's great at undertaking big projects. This plausible promise, this one goal that a lot of people come together to work on. That's very innovative. We can come up with ideas to push it forward. That works great in software. It's worked great in protests. It's worked effectively in getting, say, Trump into office. Then you have networks using the way the resistance is using it, is that it's using it to build something, through consensus, kind of a cohesive structure that it can be enforced, limits on behavior as we go global, which is like, if you're done right, that's great. If done to excess, it's going to be terrible, right? Same thing with insurgency. You can disrupt, and that's good at kind of unsticking the system if it's stuck. But if you do too much, you're just caught in this endless loop, like Russia is, right? Where only the oligarchs have power. They're the only ones that are making money. It's just constantly disrupted. And then the third thing is this, how to use networks deliberately, through AIs. And I came up with some early stuff thinking early last year on that, and I wrote it up. It's, we saw getting the AI wrong can accelerate disruption. Or right, we saw that with the way they took viral content and accelerated it as it went across Facebook and across these different platforms. And so if you had something that was extremely disruptive, it got much more play than anything else, because it was obviously more attractive and more engaging. And so they've toned that down, and but we can do a lot better. We can actually use this kind of, I think personally, AI, and everyone talks about it for all these other things. And it's not really about, building a solo intelligence. It's really about where it's actually being used most effectively and most widely is in social networks. It's actually glue. It's turning our social system through, social networking into a kind of a technological artifact, which is new. And McLuhan kind of predicted it, said we had to do that in order to kind of stop us from ripping our throats out, or collective throats out. But the idea that social networking through AI can actually smooth things out somewhat, make us more effective as a group. So you have these three different things, and how we incorporate them into the larger, social decision-making system is going to be the fight for the next 20, 30 years. If you look at, say, World War I and II was really the surprise of bureaucracy and markets. I mean, World War I, they thought it was going to be a short war because history told them that there's limits to the mobilization, right? I mean, you're going to only get a certain number of troops, and the wars are going to be relatively short because there's always, room for maneuver. but the bureaucracy was so effective at mobilizing the resources, it was able to put millions of men on the field and then immediately wiped out any kind of, maneuverability and set everything into trenches. And then markets proved so effective that they were able to finance all of that, right? They were a financing mechanism they never had up to the 1900s.
A little different than going around and like shaking down villagers for pieces of silver, I guess. Huh?
All right. Yeah, there was just not global markets like that could finance a big buildup.
Right.
I mean, you were limited by how your pocketbook. So those surprises that can really cause massive wars and unexpected kind of ferocity and duration. Maybe it's going to happen here as we kind of try to figure out how to use this network decision making in an effective way. There's flaws with each way that things are being built. I mean, like on the identity side in the resistance. I mean, I think identity as a focus is more like the short bus of history. When everyone there's, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You get on with too much identity, you're going to end up burning yourself down.
Right. Do you think that there is a valuable iterative process between the resistance and the insurgency that could lead to something productive?
I don't know. I mean, this AOC thing now that she's like putting a leadership face on the resistance, and you notice everything that she says, how she says it is all from a moral perspective. Everything.
Yeah.
There isn't one thing that's not. In fact, when she sat at the State of the Union and had that kind of scowl on her face looking at Trump, all the other guys were, all the other people there were scowling at him because, this or that identity issue. We saw, hot button issues and they didn't like him. She came back and said, I don't like him because he doesn't have a future. He's not taking us anywhere. It's like, it's an incredible wasted opportunity. It's like we should be going somewhere. And, that's morally incorrect, just to waste this opportunity.
Right.
And I was like, wow. It's interesting. I don't know. Maybe they can, through their interaction, develop something interesting. It's going to be, it can be a hell of a fight coming up in 2020.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting segue there. I was thinking earlier that it would be Trump versus an establishment figure. But, I think you wrote that AOC has become the de facto leader of the resistance and therefore may become the kingmaker in the Democratic primary. And then that to me would seem to signal that Trump would be running against somebody who knows how to navigate his battlefield. Whereas before, especially those poor other 17 GOP guys, Trump was fighting a war. They didn't even know where to look to find it, first of all. And Hillary Clinton, definitely didn't know either. And if Trump's running against Warren or Harris or somebody, I don't think that they can marshal, his, I'm trying to use military words. I don't even know what the hell I'm talking about. Can face Trump, where Trump is. But it seems to me that AOC could shift that to like a fight that happens in territory that's familiar to both people.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure who she's going to pick. She may not pick it outright, the person outright. She'll just rip down the ones that she opposes. Right. So it'd be kind of like a reverse selection, and because she's certainly too young to run, and that both she and Trump are immune to any kind of like standard expert-based policy critique, which the media, spends a lot of money doing, and academia and standard government approach and standard, establishment politics is fought over these policy quibbles. It'll cost too much, and how are you going to, pay for that, right? Well, they're totally immune to that kind of critique. I mean, you can critique them and say, and they just power right through it, right? It's like it didn't even happen, right? And so that puts them on a kind of a, there's no way that she could be taken down, and there's no way that Trump can be taken down because they are creatures of the network, right? They only can marshal a minority of the population, like 35, 40%, and there's this fight over the center. Who's less evil, right? Or who pushes your buttons less or pushes your buttons more in the positive sense.
Yeah.
And it's a big choice between, if it was, a resistance candidate and an insurgent candidate, that's a big choice. That's a big difference.
Right. Huge chasm. Nobody building a middle ground coalition there. Although I would argue that Trump was able to bring in, I think, people like me who, after gay marriage was settled and pot decriminalization looked imminent, didn't have any anchors to the Democratic Party, but had always been kind of libertarian and sort of don't mess with me, I won't mess with you. That's a lot of people that I found ended up voting for Trump as opposed to Hillary Clinton. And I think if the resistance puts a candidate forward who has at their core this moral concept, which has at its core intersectionality, which has at its core that white men are evil and the perpetrator of all oppression and must be destroyed. And the way that you destroy the power of white men is through destroying the inherent power, which is their masculine power. And so to me, I see tying it all together for me and my audience here, I see the resistance is going to end up reflecting the terms of intersectionality, and it's this concept, this philosophy of intersectionality ideology is pushing our parties to take on the form of the diagram that it draws, right? So you're going to have single women and people of color on one hand, and like white men and the people that love them on the other hand. And I just don't see how any it does happen, but self-respecting white man can vote for a coalition that has in its party people that think that you really are the devil and should, be locked up and thrown away. And, to the extent that they double down on the intersectionality and that morality system, I see the bifurcation just only getting worse.
AOC tends to move a little bit. She's not like, with the Green New Deal.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone's attacking it from the socialist angle, which seems to be and then the policy people on the left even are going, that's not doable, whatever. But I was looking at it more from I was talking about windmill theory, right? We have to have something to tilt against. Some big problem. I mean, we spent $5.5 trillion on useless wars, right? We didn't even win. And that, even a couple trillion on this thing, if it brings us together, I mean, and they're focused on kind of creating green jobs. Even if it ends up being a subsidy program, it's not going to, if it's not like more unfunded mandates, it's more like a subsidy build out of infrastructure.
Yeah.
It gets them away from the standard kind of intersection morality kind of approach.
It does.
It gets them, moving into the economic space, building a future and having something to shoot at. Even if it's the wrong thing, it gets us moving.
Yeah.
And if it's I don't know. I think there's hope there. On the insurgency side, I don't see a follow on the Trump, but it's not to say that there won't be.
You don't see there's not one on the landscape now, like a Trump 2.0, but I kind of always figured one would emerge.
Yeah. Well, it's, he was sent there as a weapon to break things up. So if things start moving, history starts moving again. New ideas start to surface. Things start happening. Look, between AOC and Trump, they've widened the debate right now. We're talking about stuff that we wouldn't have talked about. We were locked in this post-Cold War narrow band of policies that anyone even questioned the validity of. They were shouted down by the establishment.
Right. If
you said, "Why are we still in Afghanistan?" You don't know. Next year it's going to be better. And they said that 17 times, and you kind of go,
yeah,
are they insane? Or let's rethink how we're using derivatives, because they wiped out more wealth than these very extreme derivatives have added to us in wealth. Oh, no, you don't know.
You don't know. We just need a different kind, a better kind.
Right, yeah, right. Yeah, just we'll put the brakes on just for a couple of years, and then we're back to business.
Funny side story. I used to work for a firm headed by the former Secretary of the Treasury, Nicholas Brady. And at the time, he was pretty old at that point. And he used to come into our trading room, and he'd just be like, this was like 2000. He'd be like, derivatives. Got to watch out for those derivatives. Derivatives are going to be the end of all of us. And then he'd just walk out of the room. And we thought that he was kind of crazy. We thought he was just sort of like a doddering old man that didn't know what he was talking about. But
right.
But boy, He had it nailed, and he used to just throw that word around all the time. And he was right. So we've been at this for about 90 minutes. So I want to like push us through to the end. Predictions, sir, for 2020 on your part. What do you see happening?
Wow.
I know it's early.
It's a Trump running versus an opponent, depending how close they are to the resistance. If the Democratic Party can, under Pelosi, the establishment figures will pick an establishment figure. It's going to be a lot of infighting, a real civil war inside the Democratic Party, because they'll have to push it through. It's hard to make a prediction until that's resolved.
Yeah.
Right. So we got really two kind of conflicts going. There's this fight for control of the Democratic Party between AOC and her group and Pelosi and her group. And then, I don't think that the Mueller things are going to tank Trump.
No.
Okay. I mean, because those investigations really, they have to actually reduce his popularity in order to work.
Right.
Because there's no legal means of getting rid of him outside of reducing his popularity and making him vulnerable to a Senate vote. So many people think that there is actually some kind of legal process for removing him that is inexorable. It doesn't require, popularity or vote. So he'll probably be in line on, barring a heart attack going into 2020.
Yeah.
So until the Dems, resolve their civil war, I think it's going to be whoever AOC picks.
Trump versus an establishment candidate, or Trump?
No, I don't think
Trump
so.
versus a resistance candidate.
Well, if it's a resistance candidate comes out of the Democratic Party and it's versus Trump, there may be an establishment third party.
Yeah.
Right. Which would then make it really, truly chaotic.
Yeah.
Okay. So everybody's like, particularly if the establishment person is a little bit to the right.
True.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It becomes, and they're going to be calling her socialist, or whoever gets the nod on the Democratic side, socialist, and that they're going to destroy the world. But for that 35-40%, they're going to be totally signed on. This is going to be interesting. There's always a outlier that things could get disrupted to the point because people are polarizing to a high degree that we can end up with a couple incidents that roll us into a civil conflict. That's always on the outside. There's always people are so polarized now, and they don't see themselves. There's no fictive kinship anymore. And we're just, we're rapidly destroying all the common narratives and stories,
Right.
that can unite us. And people look at the other person, other American, and go, you're not me.
Right. So this is a very interesting point. And the American nationalism, man, I can't believe I'm going to wade into this here. American nationalism today is a shared belief in an imagined order that believes we thought in personal liberty and the right to pursue happiness, etc. But it was irrespective of your ancestry.
Right.
Other people will argue that nationalism in other countries was strong because of blood ties and ancestral ties. But in the United States, if the imagined order breaks down, what is it that's going to bind us as a nation?
Well, that's the thing that we have to create using networking and other things. And we have to find another way to do it.
Right.
Who's
working on that? Who's working on a new imagined order for us to all supersede our ancestral heritage and DNA and come together in a rare and unique circumstance, right? Because nationality around the world is about blood and heritage rather than an imagined order where we are in the United States. So who's working on that?
Oh, we're all working on it.
Yeah.
Online right now, but it's definitely true. If you go to Europe or you go to, Germany, for instance, I'm talking to a German the other day, and, they were going through their justification for different social policies and different things that they do. And they go, we don't understand why you don't do this in the States. Why why you just basically let people, twist in the wind, and without any kind of government support. And I go, well, it's a matter of perspective. And in Germany, everyone's kind of like related. You have a very, very cohesive ethnic outlook or, historical outlook. And it's like, it creates a different dynamic than here. It's very, very competitive here, but can we develop something new? It really depends on how well we do online, because online is where we're going to develop it.
Right. So we've talked. This will be my last question, then we'll wrap. The word cohesion has come up a number of times. Jordan Hall did a great job in his situational assessments and other pieces describing the way that the Blue Church top-down method of distributing information and narratives was effective at generating group cohesion. And it seems as though that these networks that have emerged have become effective at disrupting group cohesion. If I'm right, okay, but if I'm wrong, tell me. But are the networks that are evolving, are they inherently disruptive to group cohesion, or can they be used in a positive way?
Disruptive to the cohesion of their opposition, sure.
Yeah.
So within the context of the group, it's a lot of cohesion. In more importantly than cohesion, something more important than cohesion is coherence.
Right? Understanding.
Well, just the ability to actually formulate thought and run through a decision-making process to the end. I mean, when you don't have any relationship with somebody, you don't have any fictive kinship, everything they say, the information that they present isn't trusted. And so you can't use that you don't believe them. You don't know if they're going to actually do something. They're giving you that information because they want to tank you. They want to do you harm. So, and then if you are living if the psychological realm, if there's lots of fake information and spun information, the motive conjugation of, and all the things that would actually, spin info, you don't even trust the info itself, and how it's being, presented.
Right.
And so how can you make good decisions there? And then you have, with the networks and their kind of physical disconnection, you're losing voices. You're losing perspective. You're losing people that would actually be able to contribute, and they're just disappearing. So you don't even know if it was soft bands or that, that the information and the contributors to the decision-making process are even being heard, or that you are being heard as part of that decision-making process.
Right.
So we're wiping out coherence, in this warfare on all three dimensions. I think if we can get back to coherence online and back to coherence in networks, then it will be very, very powerful. And how to do that is going to be the big battle.
Well, I've seen the lack of coherence on the other person's face as I talk to them about things which seem plain as day to me, facts which seem real to me. I explain them in a very orderly and methodical fashion. They look at me like I'm an insane person. They don't trust what I said. They don't trust the framework, and they don't trust the data. And then they just completely disregard it. I mean, you can see it on a personal level.
Pattern matching.
My fear, as from what you just described, was that big tech is actually working against coherence deliberately. Yeah, I think so. Seems like it. If they're cutting off nodes, hiding information, squashing people, squelching them, banning them.
And then using the big AIs to accelerate certain things and hide other things. I mean, they can really mess with it. I mean, they can make us completely incoherent.
Jeez.
Look, they took the viral stuff, the stuff that was like the bombastic content, and they accelerated it.
Mm-hmm.
During 2015, 16, in order to increase the time that people spend online.
Right.
You do it on, with YouTube, and you just, you go a little bit in one direction, and it will take you all the way in that direction, down the rabbit hole.
Right, exactly.
Just to keep you, and that's like decreasing coherence, because you're bringing people into these extremes, and they're not. They're building patterns of ways of thinking that are distrustful of other people.
Right. A really great example I heard about that YouTube phenomenon is like you search for a video on how to walk, and in like 3 weeks you're watching videos on how to do extreme marathons. Right? It's like they just suck you down and push you all the way to the furthest extreme just to keep you online. So I've heard that Trump is trying to start a government program to figure out how do we manage AI and what we do with it in the future. It seems like that's a big grand project. I know a lot of people that I'm talk to online think that AI is 10,000 times more of a risk than anything else that we're facing right now. And how we manage that moving forward is going to be really key. So I'm interested to see how that plays out. But it's been 90 minutes. And frankly, I could talk to you for another 5 hours, but I'll let you go. You've been very gracious with your time. Thank you so very much. I hope we can do this again. John, where can people find you online, and what's the best way to get access to your information?
Just John Robb at Patreon.
Perfect.
And put that into Google and you'll find it. I'm pretty easy to find. And I have a couple reports up there. I have the McLuhan report, I think was free, and the online warfare report, that's free up there.
Yeah, but it's $5, guys. It's the best $5 you'll ever spend on the internet. Go ahead and sign up for it. I highly recommend it. If you want to increase your understanding of this exceptionally complicated, complex world, please do follow John Robb and start reading what he has to say. He's been immensely helpful to me, very personable and friendly on this podcast. Thank you so very much. And, I just appreciate your time today.
Well, thanks, Jack.
All right.
Nice talking to you.
Hopefully talk
Take care.
soon. Yep.